What's going on, knuckleheads? Welcome to the Fighters Rep video podcast. I'm your host, the Fighters Rep, and we're back on track. Just 5 minutes late, but slowly setting up the studio every day, trying to change the ambiance a little bit. I hope you like this one a little bit better. We do have to do something about this back here, but we'll take care of that in due time. That being said, knuckleheads, this is our Prince Charles Martin versus Andy Ruiz Jr. discussion video, and it seems that many a pundit online or a journalist or whatever you want to call them has suggested that Prince Charles Martin take on Andy Ruiz Jr. for some sort of IBF eliminator. That being said, I think the articles that are suggesting that are slightly off, and the reason that I believe that is the fight that Prince Charles Martin just recently had against Gerald El Gallo Negro Washington was for an IBF eliminator, I believe, making him the IBF mandatory challenger. Now, does that mean that fight is actually going to go forward? I don't believe so, at least not for the time being, because the owner of the IBF belt, who would be Anthony Joshua, obviously has his hands full right now. He's going to be taking on Kubrat Pulev, assuming that this whole coronavirus situation doesn't throw a monkey wrench into those plans. So, even proposing about between Andy Ruiz Jr. and Charles Martin for an IBF eliminator seems a little bit misdirected, but at the end of the day, it's something that could definitely happen, considering the fact that, they've made guys like Dillian Whyte wait 900 days as a mandatory. And we've seen Dillian Whyte toil and toil and toil away in the heavyweight division with no kind of, with no kind of relief at all in sight. And it wouldn't be the first time that we've had what seems to be countless eliminators or a mandatory taking on countless fights where he probably shouldn't be taking on the fights. But one thing that I wanted to point out that a lot of these people proposing this fight haven't really gone in depth on is the fact that Prince Charles Martin, if you guys don't know, is currently being trained, and you can see this in our interview with him on the channel. He's currently being trained by Manny Robles, which is the same Manny Robles that got Andy Ruiz Jr. to the mountaintop, got him to beat Anthony Joshua, and the same Manny Robles that Andy Ruiz Jr. seemed to give up on in the rematch, the same Manny Robles that Andy Ruiz Jr. Seemed to, I wouldn't say point the blame at, but fire, but terminate. He terminated him subsequent to the Anthony Joshua rematch, where he lost, despite the fact that he admitted at the press conference that he wasn't training and dedicating himself to that fight the way he should have been. So, knuckleheads, that is a fascinating aspect of the fight. That's almost like, the equivalent of a popular basketball player, let's say LeBron James, when he left the Cleveland Cavaliers and joined the Miami Heat, taking on the Cavaliers as a Miami Heat player. It's the same kind of thing here, but obviously more intimate, more personal, because you're dealing with a one-on-one individual sport in boxing. Could you imagine the build-up and the drama and the tension in the air if Andy Ruiz Jr. were to take on Prince Charles Martin with Manny Robles in his corner? And what coach would it be that would take charge or try to take charge or take Andy Ruiz Jr. as his charge in that fight. Now, a lot of people have pointed at Teddy Atlas and said he was going to be next. I find it a little bit disturbing that we still don't even know who Andy Ruiz Jr.'s next coach is going to be. It doesn't seem like a guy in Andy Ruiz Jr. who's extremely interested in getting back to the sport of boxing. If, even until now, we don't even know who's going to be taking over as his trainer. That's another thing to keep in mind. And obviously, he had, I'm sure, what was a big payday offered to him on 2 occasions, allegedly, if you listen to what Dillian White is saying. He had big paydays offered to him by Eddie Hearn to face Dillian White. Both times, it looks like Andy Ruiz has turned those down. Unfortunately, we've talked about that previously on this podcast, that, I guess you can say the American heavyweights we've got now aren't really stepping up to the plate to take on the challenges that the UK heavyweights are presenting, which is unfortunate. I mean, I think a fight with Dillian White is a good fight and makes sense for Andy Ruiz Jr., right? Because he beats Anthony Joshua, who's, one of the big 3, then loses to Anthony Joshua, and he gets knocked back down into this sort of gatekeeper, B+, A- heavyweight sort of level. And Dillian White has been, knocking at the door of the top 3 at that same level that I believe Andy Ruiz Jr. has been knocked down into. But I believe Dillian White's been knocking at the door for those top 3 heavyweights for a while now. And I think this would be a really good sort of crossroads fight for both guys to see who is the one, that becomes the 4th big heavyweight. In the meantime, obviously, we've got Derek Chisora and Alexander Usyk, who are also battling it out to kind of break through and enter that upper echelon of heavyweights. So, exciting times for the heavyweight division. But back to my point, Andy Ruiz Jr. should absolutely step up and take on Dillian White, although it looks like he's not going to do that. And, a lot of people are starting to say Prince Charles Martin versus Andy Ruiz Jr. And, would I like to see that fight? Yes, I absolutely would. I think that fight is full of dramatics. I think that's a competitive fight. And again, I think it's dramatic, and it's got that storyline based on what we spoke about earlier, the fact that Manny Ruiz is the coach for Prince Charles Martin. And I mean, I could only imagine the level of bad blood that would be boiling over in that fight. They're not really the kind of guys to talk a lot of trash. Guys like Manny Robles, even guys like Andy Ruiz Jr., he's not much of a talker. He's more the silent type. Even Prince Charles Martin, he'll talk a little bit, but not too much. He's more of a reserved kind of fighter. So, it would be a lot of, I think, bad blood, and any kind of trash talk that we would get, I think, would be very genuine coming out of guys that typically don't talk a lot. And I think that, whoever's promoting this fight could really, shed a light on what happened between Ruiz and Robles, and could really kind of, for lack of a better word, I mean, exploit and put it out there, that entire storyline, and make something very interesting for the boxing public to sort of tune into. So knuckleheads, that's my thought on Prince Charles Martin versus Andy Ruiz Jr. I think it's a good fight. I'll discuss a little bit more as to why I think it's a good fight. But before I do that, remember, knuckleheads, to hit that subscribe button, the bell notification icon if you're watching this now or on the replay. Again, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, like, share, comment, do everything else the good people on YouTube do to support combat sports channels. We do this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Pacific, where we talk about the fight game. And since there are no fights going on due to this really unfortunate pandemic, I mean, I didn't think in my entire life I would be saying that, fights are being canceled over a pandemic. And I wish everybody safety and health. So, I mean, because there's no real fights to talk about, we're kind of left here to talk about, fantasy fights and matchups that we wish we could, we wish we can get made and all kinds of other sort of hypotheticals. But we got to make do with what we have, and it's all good. There are a million things to talk about in combat sports. And I'm sure we can come up with something all the time. And obviously now we have the ability to video live stream interviews and bring in our guests via video. So that's pretty cool as well. Just a reminder also, pick up your Fighters Rep gear in the link below. We've got t-shirts and hoodies. It's kind of cold in California. I don't know what the hell's going on around here that the weather is like this, but it is. And so, you pick up your Fighters Rep hoodie or your tee, keep yourself warm. Anything you guys spent or donate in the super chat as well will be reinvested right back into Fighters Rep promotions and help me continue to build what I believe is the best kickboxing promotion, at least in the United States. That's my opinion right now. I think we're killing it in California. We're the only kickboxing promotion that exclusively does unified rules with a pro license. So, and you can definitely watch all our fights for free right here on the YouTube channel, man. We're keeping it free for you guys. And I think that's really valuable in these times during this pandemic where we don't have a lot to do. I mean, there's not a lot to do, so we got to, kind of kill the time here and continue to try to push the sport forward and prop it up while no events are going on, which is kind of crazy. So, let me turn to the chat real quick here. Randy Leiter is in the chat. He says he'd rather see Martin or White versus Ruiz instead of Ruiz versus Ortiz if Ruiz would just get back in some kind of shape. And, Randy, that is definitely a good point. I agree with you. I would much rather see Charles Martin or Dillian White versus Andy Ruiz. If I'm being honest, I like both of those fights equally. I think Dillian White is really deserving, as is Charles Martin. I do think it's a little tastier. It's a little juicier with the Charles Martin fight just because Manny Robles was Andy Ruiz's coach and was let go in what I believe to be a sort of disrespectful fashion. So I think, that would be more palatable for the boxing public. But a Dillian White fight is a fun fight as well. You can't really go wrong with Dillian White. He comes to fight every single time, and I think it'd be fantastic to see him test himself once again against a real tough heavyweight, Andy Ruiz Jr., although I think in their present form, or, at least with their normal and typical mindset, I would see Dillian White winning that fight, and that's probably too risky for Andy Ruiz to want to take because he showed zero dedication, he showed zero focus, he showed very little of anything in that last fight against Anthony Joshua, and you don't really see that much out of Dillian White. The worst performance I've seen out of Dillian White in the most recent history was the last one against Wak. And the only reason he looked the way he did, and he still got the win, but the only reason he looked the way he did is because he was going through that entire doping scandal where he seemed, at least based on the evidence that came out, to be innocent, and that must have been a really tough situation for him, a guy as passionate as Dillian White, basically being on the verge of being banned from the only thing he likes doing and knows how to do, which is boxing. So I can understand him being in a dark place, coming in out of shape. But typically, we don't see that from Dillian White. We see a real bull in there, and I'd love to see him fight Andy Ruiz. You also mentioned Ortiz. I mentioned Ortiz as well. I heard he might fight Luis Ortiz, but another name that recently popped up was Chris Arreola, which I find to be very strange considering Chris Arreola is way too far into the twilight of his career to be taking on a fight like that, in my opinion. I would absolutely respect Chris Arreola for taking that fight, at 39 years of age and sort of well past his prime. But I wouldn't really respect Andy Ruiz Jr., although, boxing never really gives us the fights we want most of the time. Most of the time, it's these A-side versus B-side fights. And a fight between Andy Ruiz and Chris Arreola is absolutely an A-side versus B-side fight. Let's not get that, let's not mistake that for one moment. That is the epitome of an A-side versus B-side fight. And I don't know what he'd even be accomplishing with that fight other than building up his confidence, which is, the excuse that they give a lot of fighters here. So, that's boxing for you. And you also said, if Ruiz would get back in some kind of shape, that remains to be seen as well. I mean, the fact that we haven't even found out who his trainer is going to be until now is, I think, a sign for concern. That's something that tells me that maybe this guy's heart is not in it. He made his little bit of money, and he's bouncing. That's the end for him. So, let's do a little mock tail of the tape between Charles Martin and Andy Ruiz Jr. I'll tell you, what I think each guy needs to do and who I think would win the fight. We'll go through that briefly. We'll start with the physiques. Excuse me. As usual, you have the 6'2" Andy Ruiz Jr. And, he's listed at 6'2", but I think that's a bit generous. He's probably smaller than that. 74-inch reach. Pretty great record. 35 total fights, 33 wins, 2 losses, 22 wins by KO. Those 2 losses, one of them was controversial against Joseph Parker. He probably should have won that fight. And then obviously the last one was against Anthony Joshua in his most recent fight. Then you've got Charles Martin, Prince Charles Martin, 6'5", and he's every bit of that 6'5" inches. You can tell when you meet him in person, which I have, and I've interviewed him on this channel. If you go back and look at the videos, he's every bit of that 6'5" inches. An 80-inch reach. It's actually a wingspan, but still, 80-inch reach. That's 6 inches longer than Andy Ruiz Jr. Also, a pretty fantastic record. 31 total fights. 28 wins with 2 losses and a draw. 25 of those 28 wins coming by way of knockout. And the only 2 people he lost to was also Anthony Joshua, although he lost to him by knockout, and Adam Kownacki in a unanimous decision. And it's an Adam Kownacki that I think had peaked. And if you look at Adam Kownacki now, he's definitely, headed downhill, I believe, based on his last couple performances. Just got finished by another guy we thought was out of his prime and over the hill in Robert Helenius. Kind of put it on Adam Kownacki the last time Kownacki went out. And the Kownacki that beat Charles Martin in 2018, that's not the Kownacki of today. I think that was a better Kownacki. And the Charles Martin that lost to Kownacki in 2018, I also don't believe is the Charles Martin of today. I believe Charles Martin has improved. He's coming off 2 TKOs in a row. And like we discussed earlier in the show, he TKO'd Gerald Washington in the 6th round. They have it. I thought it was the 7th, but it's listed as the 6th round. Just, beautiful finish against Gerald Washington, a guy who's also sort of been a constant in the upper echelon of the heavyweight division. Never really broke through, but did fight Deontay Wilder and had a few good rounds before getting stopped by him as well. So, this is a good fight. This is a good fight if it happens because of their current form. I think Andy Ruiz Jr. Looked really bad in that Anthony Joshua rematch with all that weight he put on. And Charles Martin looked the best he's ever looked in that fight against Gallo Negro. So obviously Gallo Negro versus Anthony Joshua, those are two completely different fighters, and you can't really 100% gauge who's going to win the fight based on that opposition, using that opposition as a barometer, because obviously Anthony Joshua is way better than Gerald Washington at this point. All respect to Gerald Washington. But yeah, I think if this fight were to happen, based on their most recent activity, it would actually be a pretty good fight. And I can see Charles Martin, a motivated Charles Martin, potentially pulling this one out, especially considering the fact that Manny Robles would be in his corner, that Charles Martin does seem dedicated, according to Manny Robles, and, he would have that advantage of a guy in Manny Robles who's worked in the opponent's corner, in Andy Ruiz's corner, and I think it would be a good fight. Obviously, Charles Martin, if he were to fight on the outside, use his jab, sort of use the same blueprint that Anthony Joshua did, he could win that fight that way. I also think Charles Martin hits very hard. That's something that a lot of people sleep on. He did finish Gallo Negro, and just being in the fight game down here and knowing people, MMA fighters and boxers and others that have seen Charles Martin work and have sparred maybe with Charles Martin, he hits really hard. He's known for having pretty good power, and I think he can keep Andy Ruiz Jr. honest and on the outside with that 80-inch reach. At the same time, if Ruiz Jr. does buckle down, does stay in shape, and if he can walk Charles Martin down in this hypothetical matchup, then we could see Andy Ruiz obviously get the win as well. Right now, if I'm being honest, I would favor, as ridiculous as some people may think I am, whatever, I would favor Charles Martin in a fight between him and Andy Ruiz Jr., just because I'm not seeing the dedication from Andy Ruiz, and despite the fact that I think he may be a more talented boxer than Charles Martin, I think Charles Martin's hard work has improved him as a fighter. And he's going to have the tangibles and the intangibles in order to beat a guy who just rests and relies on his talent the way a guy like Andy Ruiz Jr. Does, or the way a guy like Andy Ruiz Jr. would, in my estimation, based on what we've seen recently. I think the old saying of hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard, I think that applies here 1,000% if the fight were going to happen. So, knuckleheads, that's pretty much all I have for you guys. I appreciate you guys joining me. Obviously, we're going to do this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Not too many people in the chat today other than Randy Leiter. So, I would answer questions like we typically do and kind of go back and forth with you guys. But, not much going on today in the way of an audience. And I think this coronavirus is a bit hit or miss here. Oh, there we go. Randy Leiter saying, what are your thoughts on this latest Fury story regarding the farmer reneging on his wild boar story? Will there be a third Wilder fight and eventually AJ versus Fury? I do think that when something like that comes out, the story is so specific in this case that this farmer is saying that he was offered money to cover up a failed drug test for Tyson Fury. I think it was back in 2015. And the story, in case you guys haven't heard it, is there's a farmer that's saying that he was offered money to cover up Tyson Fury's drug test back in 2015. I think it was Huey Fury's as well, if I'm not mistaken. He was told to cover it up. They would give him money and to say that he had, I guess, given them wild boar, which would potentially, I guess, trigger the same sort of antibodies or whatever it is that came up in Tyson Fury's system for that drug test that I guess he had failed or whatever had happened with it that he had popped for. So now, allegedly, this farmer is coming forward and saying that, hey, they offered me money to cover up this whole thing, and there are two ways to look at it, and I'm going to look at it the American way, which is you are innocent until proven guilty. And I think that's really, really important, and I'm glad you're asking me this question so I can explain to you why I think it's so important that people should be presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. And the reason I believe that is because we live in a world where they say, I believe it's 5 to 10% of people, maybe 5% of people are narcissists, right? And narcissists are basically people that don't feel empathy, that they're in it for themselves and they just don't have the ability to feel empathy, right? Sociopaths, basically, sociopathy is what it is. And so, narcissists aren't the only ones like this. And, I've actually come across people in my life, it's been very few, but I've actually come across people like this in my life who will lie and come up with a story for attention, for fame, for money, whatever it is, and as long as those people exist, we need to presume people's innocence until they're proven guilty. So for me, yes, there's a chance that Tyson Fury failed this drug test and went up to this farmer and offered him money to say he had given him wild boar, and that's why his levels of whatever it is were elevated in his bloodstream or wherever for this drug test. But there's also the chance, and a very strong chance when you're dealing with a famous celebrity like Tyson Fury, a guy that's very rich and has a lot of money, and potentially a guy who you can get money out of. There's always that strong chance that this farmer is a fucking liar. There's always the chance, there's always the chance that he's coming up with this story to try to shake down Tyson Fury or to try to just get some attention. A lot of people, they don't understand it. But, what you have to understand about these narcissists, and again, I've dealt with these people, is that they'll put their needs ahead of the good or the health or the life or whatever of another human being. It doesn't matter to them. They don't feel empathy, whether they were abused as a child or whether they, were overindulged as a child. They just don't have the wiring in their brain to feel empathy. It's all about them. And there are, unfortunately, many people like that. I mean, if you're saying 5% of the population, that's millions upon millions of people. And so, especially in a situation like this, like I said, where you can get money and a lot of fame and attention out of this, there's a huge reward for a person like this. So, until it's proven somehow, I think we take it with a grain of salt, especially now, he's coming out with it seemingly 5 years later when Tyson Fury is back on top of the world. Tyson Fury, because of his point of view, has made a lot of enemies. He said a lot of controversial things that may have pissed a lot of people off in his country and everywhere else. And so, you're going to get, sociopaths and narcissists. It's just, up to you if you believe this farmer or not. But I do implore everybody, before you throw a guy under a bus, research. Make sure you have all the evidence before you do that, before you condemn somebody. Be sure, because here, I'll give you an example of sociopathy in action, right? Narcissism in action. And I'm going to give you an example of it right now. Right now, there are only 7 states in the United States that have postponed their voting for the primaries. This is despite the fact that there is a worldwide pandemic going on, right? And where I live in California, they're telling you not even to leave your house. 675 people have died in one day in Italy, right? Over the course of 24 hours, This thing is serious. And despite that, you've got politicians, and a lot of the times it's these people that make it to the top that exhibit these sociopathic behaviors. You've got politicians pushing for states to continue to allow people to gather and vote despite this pandemic. A gathering and a situation that is going to result in people getting sick and dying. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the person in charge of whoever's making this decision has decided that the lives of their constituents are less valuable than them voting for them. And we see this constantly. And it comes from the highest level, right? Because these narcissists, they get their kick out of being at the top and being able to manipulate people and do things like this without a conscience. So that's all I'm saying. I'm sorry I kind of went into that tirade, but that's something that you need to take into consideration. I want you to look back on your life, maybe at a relationship that didn't work out with the opposite sex, or with somebody in your family that you could just never get along with, and think about that. Look at it through that lens. 5% or so of people are narcissists. No empathy. They just pretend that they empathize, right? They pretend to have empathy, but they're not capable. And they keep engaging in conduct that, destroys others and throws others under the bus. And they just cannot stop it. These people are poison. These people that you cut out of your life. And again, I'm not saying this farmer is that, but I'm saying there's a chance. And as long as that chance exists, you have to wait until you gather all the evidence before you make a decision. And I not only say that as a human being, I say that as someone with a law degree, as someone who's been in the courts and seen these people countless times lie through their goddamn teeth over and over again to a judge. I've seen it so many times. I've seen so much lying in my life under oath that, it's gotten to the point where I get home and I tell my people, hey, tell me something real. The sky is blue. Water is wet. That's how many lies you hear when, somebody's ego and somebody's well-being is on the line. They'll say whatever they got to say. People are fucking primates, man. They're monkeys. Don't forget that. So anyway, knuckleheads, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Again, we do this Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Pacific. Appreciate you guys joining. Hit the subscribe button, the bell notification icon. Be sure to join us this weekend. We'll probably go live again just because it's boring as shit right now with this pandemic and nothing to do. And we wish everybody health, happiness, and full recovery if they don't have their health. Knuckleheads, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, keep it clean. See you guys.